in Vermont with Murray Bookchin. It's August 31st, 1994. In response to the question about forming a radical or revolutionary movement, you often say that forming study groups is a first step. I was hoping that you could discuss your approach to forming study groups.
My approach is not very original. I make no pretense about that. Study groups have been part of the revolutionary tradition going back into the 19th century, and perhaps even earlier than that. Now, a study group generally consisted of a small number of people who normally took a text, a particular work, that they respected. They might pick, if they were Marxists, Das Kapital. If they were anarchists, they might pick, for argument's sake, Kropotkin's writings, such as Factories, Fields, Workshops, or even earlier than that, his books on the two-volume French Revolution. They might pick Proudhon's writings, What is Property? And they would sit around, often guided by someone who was pretty knowledgeable of radical ideas, and I'm now being quite ecumenical. It could be Marxist, it could be anarchist, it could be utopian socialist. They might take a utopian socialist novel and read it aloud, discuss it, and analyze it. And the text, the book, would basically be a guide for them and a way of bouncing off ideas and interchanging ideas. Now, a study group, of course, comes together when one or more individuals decide that they have a certain affinity for a shared body of views. However broad those views may be, they still have it. I'll give you an example. Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, the great Russian novelist, was arrested years back in his youth for being the member of a study group on Charles Fourier's writings. Many people don't know that. What happened was that he, together with either fellow students or fellow novelists, he was one of Russia's greatest writers in the 19th century, and I'm going back to the 1830s and 40s, met in an apartment, and they began to read Charles Fourier's writings. Charles Fourier was one of the most famous utopians of that era, the early part of the 19th century. Of course, in Dostoevsky's case, the study group was found by the secret police, the Tsarist secret police, and Dostoevsky faced a mock execution in which he thought he was going to be shot. And the sentence was then, as it were, pardoned by the Tsar, and he was sent to Siberia, which led him to write novels about his life in Siberia. So a study group would be composed of people who, making contact with each other, decide that they want to form a kind of intellectual community. And they then will sit down with a text normally, or if they so want, they may sit down and draw up an agenda of issues they want to discuss each week. And they will sit and they'll study this, and through the give and take of discussion and the absorption of whatever knowledge a particular book has to offer them, they gradually enlarge their minds, as it were, and they become more sophisticated intellectually and begin to try to achieve a certain coherence. And such a group, by the way, doesn't have to be fixated ultimately on a particular work or even a particular line of study. It can then become a kind of unit. You may call it an affinity group, you may call it a political group, you can call it a club. Then become involved in some type of political activity, depending upon what their political orientation may be. This has been a very fundamental way during all times, not simply during periods of revolution or periods of social upsurge or periods of tremendous political excitement. It has occurred even in periods of, and especially in periods of deep reaction like today, to keep like-minded people together, to give them solidarity. You know, there is a life that comes out of a study group that consists not only of study, and to give them a basis for formulating shared ideas that they can put into practice. So I don't regard this as I don't regard a study group as an academic exercise. I regard it as a nuclear way, a molecular way of building a movement. And all the more important, I think a study group is all the more important because if we are going to build a political movement, I believe in a movement, I believe ultimately in a mass movement, and I believe in an organized movement. Let me make that very plain. If we're going to build a political movement, we have to have some coherence in our ideas. Because when we get to talking about the 60s, we'll see how important that really was in determining the whole life cycle of the 60s, its rise, its flourishing, and its decay. The idea of a coherent outlook, always subject to modification, never dogmatic, capable of change, but still focused. Without being focused, one strays off in every which way direction with disastrous results. So that's a study group. And it is so old that it goes back to actually to the 18th century during the period of the French Enlightenment. Like the encyclopedists or philosophes, as they were called, prior to the French Revolution of 1789 to 94, met as study groups every Sunday. They ate together, they drank together, they exchanged written stuff. And let me tell you, these writings are now classics in the literature of philosophy and science, mathematics even. D'Alembert was a mathematician. One thinks of Denis Diderot, one thinks of people like D'Alembert, one thinks of people, a whole host of these men who sat together and formed study groups essentially in the form of a kind of eating together, an afternoon together on a Sunday where they would banquet or eat well together and talk about ideas and pass manuscripts around as well as read manuscripts aloud, and or each one sometimes writing his own manuscript. Unfortunately, many of them were male. People were not into feminism as yet. And thereby writing what turned out to be one of the greatest examples of literature in ideas as well as novels and whatever you like. They even wrote novels and read them aloud to each other. That's a study group. And that kind of study group that occurred, say, in the 18th century provided the ferment that gave rise to the French Revolution. Ultimately, many of their writings appeared as pamphlets. These pamphlets were either read by fairly well-educated people, or they were reworked in very simple form for ordinary workers and peasants who were literate, and soldiers and sans-culottes and whatever you like, until by the eve of the French Revolution, the taking of the Bastille, the very guards standing in front of the palace, guarding the palace of the king, were reading the writings that came out of these study groups. And coachmen, as Arthur Young, who visited France at that time, an Englishman who traveled through the countryside and through Paris, reports, even the coachman holding the reins of the horses was so preoccupied with reading that the horse would sort of drive the carriage any which way, and the coachman had to be reminded that it was his job to take a traveler from one place to another inside the city of Paris. This is such study groups, let me add, create a kind of Enlightenment era. People become excited when ferment begins to take place, when political life becomes active, when a political culture begins to develop among the ordinary people. Such study groups become a major source of literature, and ultimately knitted together. They begin to form various clubs, they begin to form leagues, they can begin to form federations, they begin to form whatever you like, and in some cases even parties, depending upon how you want to define the word political party. Okay. So my point is that a study group is not an academic exercise, and in a time like the present one, when, in my view, we really are undergoing an ideological counter-revolution. I mean, it isn't like the McCarthyite days when people were being persecuted for their beliefs. It's not fascism, when people were being sent to concentration camps. But ideologically speaking, in terms of ideas, people are losing an understanding of the meaning of words like socialism, anarchism, and a word that I have a very great preference for, by the way, despite my strong libertarian tradition, and that is communalism, not to be confused with communism, and not to be confused with communitarianism, which generally means opening up head shops and food co-ops, fine, good work, medical clinics, but still communalism, which means really the attempt to empower the community, municipalities and towns and neighborhoods, which is very close to what I believe in, what my libertarian, left libertarian traditions really converge toward, and which in my political views is called libertarian municipalism.
When one presents the idea of forming study groups to many people, they often respond very pessimistically with the simple idea that you just can't get people together in groups anymore. People work jobs during the day, they have responsibilities at night, watching television, etc. How do you respond to these people who take a very, very pessimistic view towards study group formation?
Well, in many such cases, I'm not too sure that they really want them. And I'm going to be very frank with you. And there's a time when you do one kind of thing, and there's a time when you do another kind of thing, and there's a time when you can't do anything at all. First of all, I don't believe there's a time when you can't do anything at all. I mean, people seem to form groups when they go to the stock market, or when they visit their brokers and keep looking at the ticker tapes, at least as they flash across the screen. Oh, people get together in groups. There's no question about it. I've seen groups of young people sitting around listening to MTV with Beavis and Butthead or whatever their names are. The question is what they are really inclined to do. It's not that they can't get together in groups. They form groups. The real question that such people who ask a question of the kind that you, the real problem that people who ask the question that you really have posed is, what are their intentions? They do get together in groups. That's hogwash. The real issue is, what do they get together about? And it's not because they have to work very hard and they come home and they're very tired. Because when they're very tired, they go ahead and they look at television, and they sometimes stay up till 1 o'clock in the morning, although they may have to get up at 7 or 6 to go to work the very next day and hardly get any sleep. I've seen that. And I question basically the sincerity of such a remark. They can't get together in groups. They do. They get together in groups in bars. They get together in groups on street corners. They get together in groups when it comes to looking at MTV or going out to dance or whatever you like. And sometimes, to kick blacks or other minorities around.
Even in stadiums, they get together by the tens of thousands.
Yes, they get together in stadiums. That's hogwash. The point is they're not interested in getting together in groups like that, and I'm not that interested in trying to get them together. There are always going to be a minority of people, especially in times like these, who will want to study, who are starving to study. We get letters, Janet and I, my companion and collaborator, get letters in our post office box, P.O. Box 111, Burlington, Vermont, 05401, Green Perspectives. We get many letters every week from people who say, we got to keep in touch with you. We wish we were living in Burlington so we could be part of your group, because we have a study group in Burlington. In fact, our study group is now sort of, in a sense, multiplied into several subgroups of people who are interested in doing political activity. Others are interested in doing specialized studies, and say, in history or possibly philosophy or political theory. And then we all get together as one group here, a dozen or so, with people continually visiting us and coming from abroad in many cases, or coming from different parts of the United States or different parts of the state, and all they keep saying is, we wish we could live here, because we want to be part of a group. And we want to be part of the kind of group that you are because of what you're studying. And we're studying basic social theory and history, as well as programs for the future. So I don't accept that argument as being very valid. And if there are, unfortunately, people who work so hard that they only have time to eat and sleep and use the bathroom and can barely fornicate with each other, all I can say is, you had better look at your life and ask yourself, what are your values and what are you living for? Are you just becoming another form of cattle or beef on a hoof, grazing until the slaughter comes? Or are you vegetating? I mean, life has to have some meaning. So I challenge that statement, to be very frank with you. People do want to get together in groups. The question is, what we're talking about is what kind of groups. And in this case, I am only interested, I am primarily interested, not out of any elitism, but out of a recognition of reality. I'm interested in addressing those people who want to get together in groups to study social issues.